Speaking of poor education, I don't know where Candace Owens went to school.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know where she went to school.
Let's look that up.
It doesn't matter if she went to a private school or public school, because it is quite clear that one of two things happened.
Mm-hmm.
One, she didn't listen to anything. Well, one of three things. One, the education was horrible. Two, she just didn't listen and engage and read a single book. Or three, they taught her to be smart enough to know that if you're talking to a right-wing audience and that's the way you're making your money, you make up things.
Mm.
Here is Candace Owens on really basically trying to argue that we should not be having things like Black history or African-American history or history, period, of the United States taught in schools because it's all lies.
Oh,
she knows the secret truth.
Ad for Black Lives Matter, people to be angry. They sound angry when they're on stage. Slaves built this country. Slaves built this country. Slaves built this country. Everything that we have, we owe to slavery and slaves. And this is an argument for reparations. We've heard this nonsense over and over again from people who've never bothered to open a history book. Or maybe they have, actually. Maybe it's because they've opened history books in school that they learn this garbage nowadays. Actually, I would say it is because they open history books.
Pause it. Within 20 seconds, she went from the reason why people think slaves built this country is because they've never read a history book. And then she realized, like, oh, wait a second. There's so many history books that talk about this in an in-depth manner. I mean, we on this program have interviewed at least a half a dozen people, maybe more, maybe a dozen, over the past, I would say 4 years, who have outlined how slavery built the cotton industry, fairly low-hanging fruit. Then also, because of that, built the industrial North because of the financing of cotton and all the subsequent things like cotton mills and, companies that make clothes and whatnot. And then also financed sent money in exports of cotton to Europe, which of course financed the slave trade. I mean, our westward expansion was we've done just in the past, I don't know, month, two different, maybe 2.5 months, two different interviews about how the Trail of Tears was really a function of plantation owners in Alabama and Georgia saying, we got all this fertile land that we can grow cotton on. We got to get rid of the indigenous people who've been living here. We bring in the slaves. We grow the cotton. We make a bunch of money. I mean, all of it. It's so low-hanging fruit.
Many of our literal monuments in the capital of this country built by slaves. Washington Monument built by slaves.
And then, so like both economically and
metaphorically.
Metaphorically and literally.
Yeah.
I don't know if you remember this, Sam, but when you spoke to Yaron Brook, the Ayn Rand Institute guy, he made almost this exact same point. That was like non-slavery majority countries and countries where there was a robust slave trade, there was no difference in their prosperity. Like, slavery had no material benefit for, like, an economic prosperity for a certain kind for the U.S. So it's just interesting that, like,
it's absurd.
She's making the same claim.
Of course. I mean, you have to, and she is now about to introduce the concept of the lost cause, which is the myth that was created about 30 years out from the Civil War to justify the Civil War by the South, which was, by every historical reckoning, a function of, like, we want to have free labor that we own so that we can continue to make money. And this is our way of life here.
Yeah. The free labor element might have had something to do with the United States economy. And so, might have had something to do with it.
As part of the lost cause, you started to see all of these statues pop up in this country about Confederate leaders. And all of them, if you look at all of the ones that were removed over the past, 3 or 4 years, find out when they were built. And they were all built somewhere between 1910 and 1930, because this was the pushback. It also happened to be the peak of the KKK in this country, where something like 6% of the American population, 6 million out of 100 million at that time, were official KKK members. Official. All right, so let's just go back a little bit and hear her like sort of introduce this, just the complete fiction.
Built this country, slaves built this country. Everything that we have, we owe to slavery and slaves. And this is an argument for reparations. We've heard this nonsense over and over again from people who've never bothered to open a history book, or maybe they have actually. Maybe it's because they've opened history books in school that they learn this garbage nowadays. Actually, I would say it is because they open history books and they learn this garbage, which is just completely being washed with progressive ideals and not based in fact at all anymore. I actually had, Mediaite, whatever that website is, write an article, hit piece on me for telling the truth about the history of slavery by saying that the majority of people did not have slaves. Obviously, a very small fraction of uber wealthy people had slaves, people that were fighting the Civil War. It was a poor man's fight and a rich man's war. They were not fighting
Pause it. It's hard to know exactly what the numbers were of the people who had slaves. I think in the lead up to the war, it was something like around 20% of people owned slaves. I would imagine that would have been higher earlier in our history because the actual number of people that we had, the population numbers, but it wasn't the uber wealthy. Uber wealthy would have owned multiple slaves, and multiples of slaves, right? I mean, if you have a big plantation, then you have slaves. But so what? It was the economic engine. There was a lot of people protecting that. And it also allowed for a certain status that you had. Even if I'm poor, at least I'm not a slave. But also, largely irrelevant, the idea that only 20% of the people own slaves, let's say. But go ahead.
And not based in fact at all anymore. I actually had, Mediaite, whatever that website is, write an article, hit piece on me for telling the truth about the history of slavery by saying that the majority of people did not have slaves. Obviously, a very small fraction of uber wealthy people had slaves, people that were fighting the Civil War. It was a poor man's fight and a rich man's war. They were not fighting to keep slavery in place. They didn't have slaves, right? There was other components of the Civil War. People don't like to talk about that. Well, I'm going to say something else that's going to offend people because it's true, right? The idea that this country and the success that this country had is because slaves built this country. History betrays this narrative, okay? Let me first say, obviously, we all know slavery was abhorrent. It was an abhorrent practice all over the world, did not begin in America.
All over the world.
And actually did not begin with white people, right? It still goes on today, and it is black and brown people that keep those institutions up. And actually,
okay, pause it. I'm so sorry, but this is exactly her bread and butter. She's hitting the pleasure points for her audience. White audience, feel like you have no it's not incumbent upon you to learn about the history of this country. I will provide an alternative narrative for you that makes you feel warm and cozy. And she conflates traditional slavery in other continents with the system of chattel slavery and colonialism, which is the context that we're discussing, not historical or biblical slavery. We're talking about it within the context of the United States. So no one's saying that the U.S. invented the concept of slavery. We're saying that Western nations were imperialists, colonialists, enslaved black people, and that was foundational to chattel slavery. And she keeps doing this rhetorical thing where she says, because the foot soldiers on the ground in the Confederacy were not all wealthy capitalists who owned slaves, that negates the entire premise of the Civil War. It was not, a wealthy, a war of slave owners. There were other reasons for it. Are we supposed to judge every war in the history of the world based on the economic the position of the soldiers on the ground. That's not how.
What war has ever been waged where, like, you know what? This time we're going to do, all the rich people will be the soldiers,
Exactly.
and the poor people will sit back and do. No,
It's an aristocrat
every
war.
single
Right.
war that has ever been waged has been vast majority of soldiers, some almost like exclusively the soldiers, but the vast, overwhelming majority of soldiers are poor people.
Yeah, and they got paid.
Who do you think they were fighting on the Union side?
Right, right. And just back to her thing about, most people did not own slaves in this country. Groundbreaking news from Candace Owens here. Under a capitalist system, a majority of people do not own their own business, do not own the means of production, which in the case of chattel slavery were black slaves. So it just like, it's a completely facile notion on purpose of capitalism, how wealth is actually distributed in this country, and what wars and the people who fight in them actually constitute.
And that's what I think is kind of the interesting economic undertone of that too. The idea, like her contention that slavery was not integral to building the country, because it's also beyond just being historically revisionist. I also think it's kind of, whether she likes it or not, or whether she's intending to or not, she's implying that this system is not extractive.
Yeah.
That it was not extracting, capital on the backs of slaves. There was something else that is more kind of benevolent to the American economic project, and also by universalizing it, by saying there was slavery all over the world.
Right.
Why are we unique in being bad? Because we had slaves.
And we also had slaves and slavery, chattel slavery, for a lot longer than the other nations did, including, comparable nations that colonized Africa for this explicit purpose.
Is there more?
Yeah.
Let's keep going.
Did not begin in America, and actually did not begin with white people, right? It still goes on today, and it is black and brown people that keep those institutions up. And actually, white people were the first people to end the institutions of slavery.
And
Well,
apparently that 20% figure was households in seceding states own slaves, according to...
I've seen 20 to 30% across the country in as of 1860. But nevertheless, it really is largely I'm not even sure what the point is. This was an institution, and so much was built around this, and it was defended by the Confederacy. I mean, that's basically it. I don't think that the Union, maybe there's arguments as to whether they moved fast enough and whether they were pushed enough in terms of the Western expansion as to whether there shouldn't be states slavery there or not. But this is just the history of this country, and the idea that she's saying my history is right. Don't read your history books.
Because your conception of history is based on books, and we all know who writes those, Sam. But liberals. But also, it reminds me a little bit of some of the vaccine, the way that the right presents anti-vax stuff to their audience, which is that I have a very special narrative for you, and it's one that makes all of your anxieties natural and just. In the case of anti-vaxxers, it's I don't want to get this jab. I'm scared of it. And so actually everyone else that's getting the jab is wrong and they might die. Here are these alternate methods that might make you feel better. And it's just the same thing for racists. You don't have to succumb to be a sheeple and read history books. It's the books that are wrong. I'm right. I'm providing you with a narrative that makes your internalized racism actually righteous. And I'm flipping it on the rest of society. And it's just so atomizing and so antisocial, honestly. And that's what they get. That's what they provide in a variety of different flavors. If you want the racism flavor, the science denial flavor, it's anti-society.
N.J. Malman, in 1861, the Army of North Virginia was a slavery army with 1 in 3 or 1 in 2 soldiers in the army either owning or family owning slaves. Poor whites fought because of servile insurrection. Their apocalypse myth, where they thought if they freed slaves, the slaves would have murdered them. Confederate generals like Longstreet spoke about this to his troops. Militant apathy makes the point. The majority of black people were slaves. Slam Cedar says 20% of the people in the South, where there were far fewer people than in the North.
It also is just so fascinating that these conservatives are obsessed with, the left being censorious, and we are in the midst of mass book bans in states like Florida, and then top conservative influencers like herself arguing that all history books are indoctrination.
Exactly.